Hello and welcome to this presentation on how to use fecal egg counts in equine practice. So when we discuss the utility and usefulness of fecal egg counts in equine practice, we have to really define what we are going to use the egg counts for. And I usually delineate between the 4 different applications that you see here on the screen. And in this presentation, we're going to discuss these separately. So we have the fecal egg count reduction test for screening of anthelmintic treatment efficacy. We have the determination of strongyl egg shedding levels in adult horses. We have monitoring of vascular infections in foals, and then we have the clinical diagnosis. And by clinical diagnosis, I mean the situation where you have a clinical case with symptoms and you're wanting to run a fecal egg count to find out whether there could be any parasitic involvement. So let's get these through these one by one. So the fecal egg count reduction test is the most important by far use of fecal egg count in equine practice today. We need to know whether the treatments that we are recommending or prescribing are actually working the way we intend them to be. With all the drug resistance that's out there, we just can't be sure without actually routinely testing the efficacy. The fecal egg count reduction test is the only method available for doing so in horses. There are no alternatives. And the simple way of doing it is to collect samples at the day of treatment and again 2 weeks post-treatment and calculate the percent reduction as shown in the formula on the screen. Here's one example with a horse that had a 94% reduction. Now, this is the standard way of doing it. The pragmatic fecal egg count reduction tests, which might be a little bit simpler and yet still useful, is to at least run the post-treatment samples, even without knowing what the pre-treatment egg count levels were. We are not expecting positive egg counts 2 weeks post-treatment. And if we do get positive egg counts, we know that there's something wrong, and it could be resistance, it could be failure of administration or other, but there's certainly an opportunity to go back and revisit the routines and perhaps set up a real test to reevaluate. So let's look at a few examples of the type of data that you get with a fecal egg count reduction test. Here are some data from a study that we did some years ago. You see the pre-treatment egg count level and post-treatment egg counts in individual horses from 2 different farms. They were tested with the same anthelmintic. One had a 95% mean reduction, which is within the expected levels for this particular drug, and the other one was 83%. So here's one farm with signs of resistance and one with no signs of resistance. And one of the other points here is the individual horse-to-horse variability. Just notice on both farms that we do get numbers that appear low or normal. So this is just to drive home the point that the fecal egg count reduction test is not an individual diagnostic test. It is a herd diagnosis. Actually, we're not even diagnosing the herd. We are actually diagnosing the parasite population. That's what we're measuring with a fecal egg count reduction test. And each horse is just a biological sample from that parasite population present on this farm. And so the more horses we can sample, the more biological replicates we get, and the more reliable the results. The recommendation from the American Association of Equine Practitioners is to have at least 6 egg count positive horses in a fecal egg count reduction test. We are fully aware that there are lots of instances, examples, where there just aren't that many egg count positive horses present on the farm. And of course, you could still go ahead and run the fecal egg count reduction tests. You just have to exercise more caution in interpreting the results. And let's look at a few examples with less than 6 horses and some examples where interpretation is actually difficult. So here are some real life examples, 3 horses on 3, 3, and 4 horses on different farms. Look at the top one. 2 horses had low pre-treatment egg counts, but did reduce to 0, whereas the third horse had a high egg count and didn't reduce. So how can we interpret this? Was that third horse just not treated, or did it spit out the paste, or was something else wrong? Or did the all three horses actually get adequately dosed, and then we just see apparently higher egg count reductions in those horses with low pre-treatment egg count? So with the low pre-treatment egg counts, we do run into an issue with the detection limit of the egg counting technique that we use. The typical McMaster is 25 or 50 eggs per gram, and that's the minimum detection limit. So if you start out with a low egg count level, we might just get reduced to a positive egg count, but that's below the detection limit, so it won't get detected, and then it appears as a 0 even when it's not, and then the fecal egg count reduction looks higher than it actually is. So this result is just inconclusive. We can't really say whether there are signs of resistance on this farm or not, and the recommendation is to repeat the tests. Ideally, we would like higher pre-treatment egg count levels, but that, is always the case, and we rarely can just decide what types of egg counts we can get. And so the solution might be a more sensitive diagnostic egg count technique with a lower detection limit. And you can read more about that in some of our publications or in Handbook of Equine Parasite Control, where there's a discussion of appropriate egg counting techniques. Now look at the next farm. It had 2 horses with high pre-treatment egg count levels that both reduced to 0, and then a third horse with a low to moderate egg count level that didn't reduce at all. So kind of the same scenario as above, but a different starting egg count levels. In this case, we have a little more confidence to say that it looks like we had good reduction in those 2 first horses because of their high pre-treatment egg count levels. And it is suspicious that perhaps that third horse just didn't get treated or spit out the dose, as we often see. So the recommendation here might be to just simply go back and treat this one horse with the same drug and see if it reduces this next time. But yet again, it's still not completely conclusive when you only have 3 horses. And then the last one is also a typical example, particularly with adult horses, where we sometimes just get very low pre-treatment egg count levels. If we get any pre-treatment egg count levels at all, it's not unusual to see them in this range. So in this case, we had 4 horses, low pre-treatment egg count levels. They all reduced to 0. Apparently, that looks like 100%. And it might be, but we just can't rule out, depending again on what egg counting technique we used, whether or not this is a true 100% reduction, or whether the reduction was less than 100% but just didn't get detected by the egg counting technique. So just a few considerations when you get these inconclusive types of results that are likely to happen out there in the real world. It's rarely just black and white. Unfortunately, we're dealing with variability and small group sizes, but at least here are a few suggestions for you to consider when you interpret the results. Bottom line is that the fecal egg count reduction test is very important, and it's a very important application of the fecal egg count. You really cannot design a responsible parasite control program for horses without having some use of fecal egg count reduction assessment in your protocol on a routine basis. You really have to know whether the treatments that you're recommending or prescribing actually work. The only way to do it is with a fecal egg count reduction test. Now, look at the next one, the termination of egg shedding. That's another application. And the basis for that is these observations that have been made by several different people around the world, that we have this over-dispersed distribution of parasite burdens amongst herds of horses, and also egg count shedding levels. So the 20/80 rule has been described in several different publications, and what that means is that at any point in time in adult horses, 20% of the horses will be shedding 80% of the total Stranja egg output. So that's an over-dispersal. We have the majority of horses with very low or negative egg counts, and then just a few that are in the high egg count category. So it gets very important for us to really identify which horses are the ones with the high egg count. We can't just, by looking at the horse, argue whether it might be more or less likely to be a high egg count horse. We have to actually run the egg count. The chart here on the slide just illustrates the point. We had a population of horses in one of the studies that we did. In this slide, they are just ranked by increasing egg count. So you have the individual horses with 0 EPG starting to the left, and then as you go towards the right on the chart, you get into higher and higher counts, and the highest horse, as you can tell, had a little bit over 5,000 EPG. This is normal. In a normal population of horses, of healthy horses, you can get this range of counts. But what you notice is that under the solid line, that's the 200 eggs per gram level. 2/3 of this population of horses was below 200 eggs per gram, and 500 eggs per gram, which is the next line up. Well, even more, we're up to about 80% of the horses that were below this level. So the high egg count shedders is a small minority, but they are important because they are responsible for the majority of parasite contamination on those paddocks and pastures. So it does get important to identify them, target them with additional treatments. They can get additional treatments over that basic foundation of treatments that we recommend for all horses. So we make sure that we can suppress the egg shedding in those high egg count horses because they're very likely to return to that same egg count levels after treatment. And that point is illustrated on this slide, and this is just one study that I did many years ago, actually my very first published paper ever. Several other groups have shown this as well since, that individual horses are likely to remain or return to the same egg count shedding levels across time. So here is a population of 424 adult horses, and looking at their Strongyle egg count levels. They were sampled twice a year over the course of 3 years, so we had 6 data points. And if you look at the top line, you see every time a horse that had 2 negative egg counts, 2 consecutive negative egg counts, the probability of the third egg count also being negative was 82%. So that's a very high probability, especially considering that the majority of horses actually were negative. That was the single most common observation in the data set, was the number 0. So you can look at the other findings on the chart, but particularly at the low or negative egg count levels, that's where we see the very, very strong shedding consistency. So horses are able to maintain low egg count shedding levels across time, even without any anthelmintic treatment. And so they take care of Strongyle egg count outputs by themselves, and then we can focus on the few high shedders. For determination of egg shedding, the fecal egg count in adult horses and Strongyle egg shedding, it's very, very useful, and it's a useful tool for us to really target and tailor our parasite control program in those age groups. So the third one is monitoring ascarid infections. That's yet another application of the fecal egg count in foals, and it's very important. We know that we can tell the eggs apart. They look very different. You look at them down here to your lower right, the Strongyle egg and the ascarid egg. So very easy to identify both on a fecal egg count. The typical pattern is illustrated in this chart here. You have the blue line is ascarid egg counts, and the red line is Strongyle egg counts in foals across their increasing age. So you have month by month egg counts. So there's a mean egg count for a group of foals here for every month. So what we notice is the peak at 4 months of age for ascarids, and then without anthelmintic intervention, any treatment at all, after that peak, the ascarid egg counts just steadily decline and eventually disappear. There's a little bit of a second wave all the way out at 7, 8, 9 months, and that's something we sometimes see, but then they quickly disappear and they never come back. In the meantime, the strongyles have taken over as the dominating parasite, and that transition seems to happen right at about 5 or so months of age. And that coincides with weaning age in a lot of operations. So yet again, that's a stressful period. We want to make sure that we treat them with an anthelmintic that works against the parasite that is the dominating parasite at that point in time. We also know from all the resistance findings that the anthelmintics that we have available for treatment of Parascaris and that still work against Parascaris usually do not work well, if at all, against strongyles because of all the resistance that has developed, and vice versa. So we rarely just have a single product. We could go for a combination product, but we still need we need to know what we have to look for in that combination to really find a product that would target and treat the parasites that we find. So we need those egg counts for that purpose in foals at around weaning age. And just to illustrate the point, this is a different data set from a different study that we did in Kentucky, and these horses were treated and dewormed, but yet we still saw this pattern. Pattern is the same. You have the peak, the blue peak at about 4, in this case 4.5 months of age, and then they disappear, and then the strongyles take over. So we think that this is an epidemiological pattern that is independent of weather, climate, and time of year, but really is primarily driven by the age of the foals. And so that's likely to also be the case in New Zealand, for example. The monitoring of ascoid infections is yet another useful way of incorporating fecal egg counts in your parasite control program. So while getting to the last point, the clinical diagnosis, let me just say up front that fecal egg counts are not useful for that purpose. And when again I say clinical diagnosis, I mean the situation where we have a case, a clinical case with symptoms, and we suspect parasitic involvement. The fecal egg count is really not going to give us any useful information in that scenario. So why is that? There are actually several different reasons. One of them is the false negative problem. So here we have some data from a study. We published a retrospective validation of fecal egg count techniques. We published a year ago. We're looking at the Parascaris egg count here. So the positive predictive value means that in case you have a positive egg count, what's the probability of the foal actually being ascarid positive, being actually truly infected with Parascaris parasites, and that was a 95%, so only 5% false positives. So that's at least useful. You can trust a positive egg count, but look at the negative predictive value. There are false negatives, and so you cannot necessarily in a foal trust a negative egg count. Even though it's negative, it could still have ascarid parasites. And most importantly, no linear correlation with the worm burdens. We just don't have that. Higher egg counts don't mean more worms, and this is for strongyles as well as ascarids. Unfortunately so, this is just the case, and we just have to know that when we talk to our clients that more eggs don't mean more worms. So with strongyles, we couldn't determine these predictive values and specificity sensitivities. And that was because in the data set we had available, we had no horses that were negative, no egg count negative horses and no worm count negative horses. They all had strongyle parasites, which probably illustrates the point that most horses have strongyle parasites at any point in time. And so the whole idea of a parasite worm-free horse is not realistic. But it meant that we couldn't calculate these values because you need that in a 2x2 table. So instead what we looked at was just to take the population of horses, 700 horses that we had in the database, and then arbitrarily chose different egg count cutoff thresholds to divide the group into two and looked at whether we had any differences in worm counts. So you have a few examples here on the slide. Look at the one to the left at the 100 eggs per gram cutoff. we had significant difference with horses above that cutoff having significantly more worms. And as you can see from the slide, those few extreme outlier horses with very high worm burdens, we had a couple with more than 1 million worms there, some in the 800 to 900,000 worm count range. Those were all in the treatment, if you will, group. And so we had significant differences in worm counts all the way up to 500 strongyle eggs per gram, and then above that, no differences. So that sort of lends some support to the whole idea of choosing a cutoff for treatment in this range. However, we just need to keep in mind that horses below that, those thresholds still had worms, and actually in the range of 100 to 200,000 worms. And that's normal for young horses to have. It doesn't necessarily, and it rarely means any clinical health implications at all. But can we guarantee that these horses will not have any health issues as a result of these worm burdens? No, we can't. So that's also a reason for why we can't really use the egg counts as a clinical diagnostic tool. But perhaps most importantly, with the strongyle parasites, both the cyathostomins and the large strongyles, we just have to keep in mind that the pathogenic stage of these parasites is the larvae, the encysted cyathostomin larvae and the migrating large strongyle larvae. Larvae do not make eggs. So the egg count don't tell us anything about the presence of encysted cyathostomin larvae or migrating large strongyle larvae. So we can't say anything about the pathogenic stage. That's probably the main reason for why we can't use egg counts. And then for clinical diagnosis, and then we just have to keep in mind that, like I said before, most horses have strongyle parasites at any point in time, and they are therefore somewhat likely to also be egg count positive. And just because you have a horse that's egg count positive and it is showing symptoms of some sort doesn't mean that there's any relation between the two findings. A horse is just somewhat likely to be positive for their egg counts, whether they have clinical symptoms or not. It doesn't mean anything. So a few more comments about tapeworms, because that's another challenge with fecal egg counts. We do require some modifications of the tapeworm diagnostic methods before we can actually get any meaningful information for tapeworms in horses. In this paper, we summarized all the diagnostics that have been evaluated and validated. And in the bracket here, the red bracket, you can see that the standard McMaster, and there are two different versions of it here evaluated, had diagnostic sensitivity of less than 10%. Less than 10%, that is not just poor or bad, that's pathetic, useless. So the simple McMaster is not reliable for detection of tapeworm eggs in fecal samples of horses. However, the good news from this table is that there are a couple different modifications of egg counting methods that have turned out to be useful, but they do require more work. There are sort of two routes you can choose. There's a Wisconsin approach with 5 or 10 grams of feces, and then there's sticking with a McMaster and then just increasing the amount of feces from the 5 grams to 30 or 40 grams. In both cases, centrifugation is required. It seems to be very important for getting a decent performance of the fecal egg count test for tapeworm diagnostics. Also, just to kind of make you all aware that there are alternatives to fecal egg counts for tapeworms. There's actually several different serological tests, ELISA-based tests developed, though none of those are commercially available in New Zealand, but they are in England at the moment, but maybe in the future they could be made available elsewhere, and they've been well validated with actually pretty good numbers in terms of sensitivity and specificity. Bottom line, however, regarding fecal egg count and using those for clinical diagnosis, that's just a no-go, not useful, and don't do it if you have a horse with symptoms suggesting a parasitic disease, go ahead and deworm that horse and see if it gets better. Don't waste your time on fecal egg counts. So just in summary, how can we use fecal egg counts in horses? In foals, we can monitor aspirates. The youngest age we recommend egg counts to be done is in the 4 to 6 month age range. Earlier than that, egg counts really aren't all that useful. The aspirates, the pre-patent period of aspirate parasites is about 3 months. And prior to 3 months of age in foals, we rarely see much other than maybe the occasional strongyle egg that really doesn't lead us to change anything in our approach. And we do recommend testing for treatment efficacy in all age groups here. In yearlings, most importantly is really just to take into account seasonality. I've included a chart for Palmerston North on the lower right, where you can see the pasture infectivity levels at different times of the year. So there's certainly some seasonality there. There's some times of year where there's little or no parasites, larval development on pasture, where the infectivity will be very low in the winter, and then in the summer, that's where you sort of need to focus on your treatments. We do not recommend screening for strongyle shedding levels in yearlings because they are just considered susceptible young individuals, and most of them are likely to be high shedders anyway. But in adult horses, here we use mares as an example for stud farms. We do monitor the strongyle levels. We do want to identify those high shedders and make sure that they get targeted. And like I said, we recommend testing efficacy on a routine basis. With that, I encourage everyone who's on Twitter to follow me on Twitter. There, you can follow the work that we do, the papers we published, videos that we put out, and other information about equine parasite control.